At 07:35 on the morning of December 8, 1941, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat alone in his cabin aboard the flagship Nagato, anchored in Hiroshima Bay. His staff officers were celebrating in the wardroom. Sake was flowing. Someone was singing. The radio had just confirmed the destruction of the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 353 aircraft had devastated the naval base. 8 battleships sunk or damaged. 188 American planes destroyed. 2,403 Americans dead. Yamamoto didn't join the celebration. 57 years old. 37 years in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The architect of the most devastating surprise attack in modern naval history. And he sat alone, staring at the bulkhead, sunk in what witnesses later described as apparent depression. His chief of staff found him there an hour later, asked if something was wrong. Yamamoto's response would haunt Japanese military planners for the next 4 years. "The Americans will be angry now," he said. "Very angry. And angry Americans are the most dangerous force on earth." The same hands that had planned Pearl Harbor were now trembling. The same mind that had calculated every detail of the attack was now calculating something far more terrifying: the mathematical certainty of Japan's defeat. Yamamoto understood something his celebrating officers did not. He had lived in America, studied at Harvard, traveled from Boston to Texas, hitchhiking across a nation whose industrial capacity dwarfed anything Japan could imagine. He had played poker with American naval officers in Washington for 2 years. He knew how Americans thought, how they fought, how they responded to being attacked. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that Japan had just made a fatal mistake. The numbers told the story. In 1941, the United States produced 500 million tons of coal. Japan produced 50 million. America pumped 1.5 billion barrels of oil. Japan produced 2.7 million barrels domestically, less than 1% of American output. A single day of American oil production exceeded Japan's entire annual domestic supply. The United States manufactured 13 times more steel than Japan, 40 times more automobiles, 222 times more oil. These weren't abstract statistics to Yamamoto. He had seen American factories firsthand. He had watched the endless assembly lines in Detroit. He had toured the oil fields of Texas. He had calculated, with the precision of a professional gambler, exactly how long Japan could survive a war of attrition against such industrial might. 6 months, he had told Prime Minister Kono before the attack. "I can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, I have no expectation of success. If the war continues for 2 or 3 years, I have absolutely no confidence in the outcome." His superiors had ignored him. The army generals who dominated the government wanted war. They believed one decisive battle would force America to negotiate. They pointed to the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, when Japan's stunning victory at Tsushima had forced Russia to sue for peace. Yamamoto knew the comparison was meaningless. Russia had been fighting on the other side of the world, at the end of impossibly long supply lines. America would be fighting to avenge a sneak attack. There was no comparison. If you want to understand how Yamamoto's predictions came true with devastating accuracy, hit that like button. It helps us share more untold perspectives from the Pacific War. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Yamamoto. To understand why he alone among Japan's military leaders saw the coming catastrophe, you need to understand the man himself. Isoroku Takano was born in Nagaoka, Japan, on April 4, 1884. His father was 56 years old at the time, an intermediate-rank samurai. In Japanese tradition, the boy was named Isoroku, which literally means 56, marking his father's age. In 1916, he was adopted into the Yamamoto family, a higher-ranking samurai clan, and took their name. He graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1904, ranking 11th in his class. A year later, at 21 years old, he served as an ensign aboard the armored cruiser Nishin during the Russo-Japanese War. At the Battle of Tsushima on May 27, 1905, Russian shells struck the Nishin repeatedly. Yamamoto lost 2 fingers on his left hand and suffered shrapnel wounds across his body. He would carry those scars for the rest of his life. The experience taught him something crucial. Naval warfare was brutal, unpredictable, and decisive. A single battle could change the course of history. But it also taught him something else. Japan had won at Tsushima because Russia was exhausted, overextended, and fighting 12,000 miles from home. Those conditions would never apply to America. In 1919, at 35 years old, Yamamoto traveled to the United States as a special student at Harvard University. He lived in a rented room in Brookline, Massachusetts. He studied economics and the oil industry. He learned English with a thick Boston accent that American officers would later find amusing. And he discovered something that would define his strategic thinking for the rest of his career: poker. At Harvard, American classmates introduced Yamamoto to the game. He became obsessed with it. The mathematics of probability, the psychology of bluffing, the calculated risks, the patient accumulation of small advantages. He would stay up all night, winning hand after hand, while his American friends tried to figure out how this quiet Japanese officer kept taking their money. When a friend asked how he'd learned card games so quickly, Yamamoto explained with characteristic precision, "If I can keep 5,000 ideographs in my mind, it is not hard to remember 52 cards." He used his poker winnings to hitchhike across America during summer breaks. From Massachusetts to Texas, through the industrial heartland, past the oil derricks and steel mills and automobile factories. He saw something his army counterparts back in Tokyo could never understand: the sheer, overwhelming scale of American industrial capacity. In 1926, Yamamoto returned to the United States as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. For 2 years, he attended dinners with American naval officers, played poker with Pentagon officials, and studied American military doctrine. He learned to speak fluent English. He traveled extensively, observing American customs, business practices, and military installations. He developed a troubling conclusion. The American Navy, he wrote, was a club for golfers and bridge players. Their officers were soft. Their peacetime training was lax. But their industrial base was overwhelming. In a short war, Japan might prevail through superior skill and tactics. In a long war, America would simply outproduce Japan until victory became inevitable. The math was simple. Japan cannot beat America, Yamamoto told a group of schoolchildren in 1940. Therefore, Japan should not fight America. But by 1941, the military government in Tokyo had decided otherwise. Japan needed oil. 90% of Japanese oil came from foreign sources, and 80% of that came from the United States. When Japan invaded southern French Indochina in July 1941, threatening British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, President Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets and imposed a complete oil embargo. Japan's oil reserves would last 18 months at peacetime consumption, less in wartime. The military leadership faced a choice: abandon their expansion plans and withdraw from China, which they considered politically impossible, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force. Seizing the Dutch East Indies meant war with Britain and the Netherlands. And war with Britain and the Netherlands meant war with the United States. Yamamoto was ordered to plan the attack. He approached the problem the way he approached poker: calculate the odds, assess the opponent's weaknesses, strike at the moment of maximum vulnerability, and never, ever, let the game go long. The American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor was his target. Destroy it, and Japan would have 6 months to a year to consolidate its conquests before America could rebuild. In that window, Japan could seize the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and establish a defensive perimeter so strong that America might choose negotiation over the cost of breaking it. It was a gambler's strategy, a long shot, but Yamamoto saw no other option. He knew his superiors didn't understand the risks. In September 1941, he wrote to a nationalist politician, "Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. I wonder if our politicians have confidence as to the final outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices." The Japanese military press quoted the first part of his statement as evidence of Yamamoto's aggressive confidence. They omitted the skeptical final sentence. They didn't understand that Yamamoto was warning them, not boasting. On November 26, 1941, the first air fleet under Vice Admiral Nagumo Chuchi sailed from Hido-Kapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. 6 aircraft carriers, 414 planes, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, 23 support vessels. Yamamoto remained behind on the Nagato. He could not command the attack directly. His role was strategic coordination, not tactical execution. For 11 days, he waited in increasing tension as the fleet maintained strict radio silence across 3,500 miles of open ocean. On December 7, 1941, at 600 hours Hawaii time, the first wave of 183 aircraft launched from the Japanese carriers. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda led the attack. At 0749, he transmitted the code phrase, Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. Complete surprise achieved. The attack devastated Pearl Harbor, but it failed to achieve Yamamoto's primary objective. The American aircraft carriers were not in port. Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway. Saratoga was in San Diego for repairs. The 3 ships that Yamamoto most needed to destroy had escaped by pure chance. Worse, Nagumo refused to launch a third attack wave. Yamamoto had wanted the fuel tank farms destroyed, the submarine base, the repair facilities, the ammunition depots. Without these targets, Pearl Harbor could be rebuilt. With them destroyed, the Pacific Fleet would have been crippled for years. Nagumo was satisfied with the battleships he had sunk. He turned his fleet toward home. Yamamoto received the reports in his cabin on the Nagato. Initial euphoria gave way to cold assessment. The battleships were obsolete anyway. Aircraft carriers had made them irrelevant, a fact Yamamoto himself had proven by the attack. The carriers had escaped. The infrastructure was intact, and the Americans were now united in a fury of vengeance that Japanese planners had failed to anticipate. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy, Yamamoto wrote to a colleague on January 9, 1942. It is more a matter of shame, simply, for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack. The counterattack came faster than anyone expected. On April 18, 1942, 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo. The Doolittle raid caused minimal physical damage, but it proved that the Japanese homeland was vulnerable. The psychological impact was devastating. Emperor Hirohito had been exposed to danger. The military had failed to protect the nation. Yamamoto was mortified. He had promised the emperor that the attack on Pearl Harbor would protect Japan. For months later, American bombs were falling on Tokyo. He accelerated his plan to destroy the remaining American carriers. He would lure them into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of land 1,300 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor. Capture Midway, and the American carriers would have to respond. Destroy the carriers, and the Pacific would belong to Japan for at least 2 years. The plan was complex. Too complex. Yamamoto divided his forces into multiple groups spread across thousands of miles. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands. The main carrier strike force under Nagumo. An invasion force for Midway. Yamamoto's own battleship group lurking far to the rear. The strategy reflected Yamamoto's poker instincts. Multiple feints. Hidden strength. The appearance of weakness masking overwhelming force. It worked brilliantly at the card table. It failed catastrophically at Midway. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American codebreakers had cracked the Japanese naval code, Jan 25. They knew the target. They knew the date. They knew the composition of the Japanese forces. Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor laid a trap of his own. On June 4, 1942, exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Midway began. Nagumo's carriers launched their attack on the island, expecting no American carriers within 1,000 miles. 3 American carriers were waiting 200 miles to the northeast. The battle turned on 5 minutes of chaos. American torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese fleet in waves, flying low and slow without fighter protection. They were slaughtered. 41 of 42 torpedo planes were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. But the attacks pulled the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level. And while the Zeros were chasing the last torpedo bombers, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived overhead, unopposed. At 10:22, 37 dive bombers from Enterprise pushed over into their dives on the carriers Kaga and Akagi. At the same moment, 17 bombers from Yorktown attacked the carrier Soryu. Within 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 carriers were burning. The 4th, Hiryu, was destroyed that afternoon. For carriers, 322 aircraft, over 3,000 sailors and airmen. All 4 carriers had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now they were gone. Yamamoto received the reports in stunned silence. His staff watched him pace the bridge of the Yamato. At 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, he ordered the fleet to withdraw. The gamble had failed. 6 months, he had predicted. I can run wild for 6 months. Midway occurred exactly 6 months and 1 day after Pearl Harbor. From that moment forward, Yamamoto knew the war was lost. Japan had spent its first-line carrier strength. The Americans, meanwhile, were just beginning to mobilize. By the end of 1942, American shipyards would launch 7 new aircraft carriers. By 1944, that number would reach 141 carriers of all types. Japan would build 17 carriers during the entire war. The United States would build 141. Over the course of the war, America produced 325,000 combat aircraft. Japan produced 76,000. American industry built 807 new warships. Japan built 211. Yamamoto understood these numbers better than any Japanese officer. He had seen American industrial capacity firsthand. He had calculated the production curves, the training pipelines, the resource flows. And he knew that every month the war continued, the gap would widen until Japanese defeat became mathematically inevitable. The Guadalcanal campaign bled Japan's remaining strength. 6 months of brutal fighting from August 1942 to February 1943. Japanese naval aviators died faster than they could be replaced. By early 1943, the veteran pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor were gone. Their replacements were half-trained, rushed into combat before they were ready. In a letter to a friend in March 1943, Yamamoto wrote with devastating clarity, "I sense that my life must be completed in the next 100 days." He was off by exactly 18 days. On April 13, 1943, Yamamoto played a game of shogi with Vice Admiral Ranosuke Kosaka at Rabaul, the major Japanese base in New Britain. Between moves, they discussed strategy. Yamamoto announced his intention to visit forward bases in the Solomon Islands. His men needed a morale boost. He would provide it personally. Kosaka warned against the trip. The area was dangerous. American fighters had been increasingly active. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of Japanese ground forces at Rabaul, had barely survived an ambush during a similar flight just 2 months earlier. Yamamoto dismissed the concerns. Even if it were dangerous, he said, I could not turn back now. His staff transmitted the itinerary over naval radio. On April 18th, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet would fly from Rabaul to Belaley Airfield near Bougainville, arriving at 0800 hours Tokyo time. 2 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers. 6 Zero fighter escorts. Standard formation. What Yamamoto didn't know was that American codebreakers at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, the same unit that had cracked Japanese communications before Midway, intercepted and decoded the message within hours. Admiral Nimitz faced a decision. The intelligence was detailed enough to plan an ambush. But assassinating Yamamoto would reveal that American codebreakers had penetrated Japanese naval communications. If the Japanese changed their codes, the intelligence advantage would be lost. Nimitz calculated the trade-offs. Yamamoto was Japan's best strategic mind. His death would damage Japanese morale and deprive them of irreplaceable leadership. The risk was worth it. The order went to Admiral William Halsey in the South Pacific. Halsey passed it to Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher on Guadalcanal. Mitcher assigned the mission to the 339th Fighter Squadron, equipped with long-range P-38 Lightning fighters. Major John Mitchell planned the attack with mathematical precision. The intercept would occur over Bougainville, 430 miles from Guadalcanal. The P-38s would fly a circuitous route of over 600 miles to avoid detection, wave-hopping at 50 feet above the ocean, maintaining strict radio silence. 18 P-38s took off from Henderson Field at 0725 on April 18, 1943, 1 year to the day after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. At 0934, the American fighters arrived at the intercept point on the western coast of Bougainville. Visibility was excellent, and right on schedule, descending toward Belaley, they spotted 2 Betty bombers with 6 Zero escorts. The attack was swift and brutal. Lieutenant Rex Barber and Captain Thomas Lanfear of the killer flight dove on the bombers. Within minutes, both Bettys were going down. One crashed into the jungle. The other plunged into the sea. Lieutenant Barber would later be credited with shooting down Yamamoto's aircraft. The debate over who exactly fired the fatal shots continues to this day. At 11:52 that morning, as the surviving P-38s prepared to land at Henderson Field, Captain Lanfear broke radio silence with a single transmission. That son of a bitch will not be dictating any peace terms in the White House. The Americans did not immediately know if they had killed Yamamoto. Japanese search parties found the wreckage the next day. Yamamoto's body was still strapped in his seat, thrown from the aircraft, but clutching his samurai sword. An autopsy found 2 bullet wounds. He had likely died instantly. Japan announced his death on May 21, 1943. His ashes were returned to Tokyo aboard the battleship Musashi. He received a state funeral on June 5. The emperor posthumously promoted him to fleet admiral and awarded him the Order of the Chrysanthemum. His funeral procession passed by the quarters of his favorite geisha, Kawaii Chiyoko, on the way to the cemetery. Perhaps with hidden purpose. Japan never recovered from Midway. Never recovered from Guadalcanal. Never recovered from the death of the one commander who had understood, from the very beginning, that the war was unwinnable. In the 28 months between Yamamoto's death and Japan's surrender, American industrial might delivered exactly the devastation he had predicted. 340,000 combat sorties over Japan. 2 atomic bombs. 66 Japanese cities firebombed. 2 million Japanese dead. Yamamoto had seen it coming. He had warned his superiors. He had calculated the odds with the precision of a professional gambler. And when his warnings were ignored, he did his duty, planned the attack, and watched his predictions come true with horrifying accuracy. I can run wild for 6 months. After that, I have no expectation of success. He was right. Almost to the day. The gambler who never lost at poker had finally met an opponent he couldn't bluff. An opponent with more chips than he could count. An opponent who would stay at the table until the last hand was played. His final prediction came true as well. I sensed that my life must be completed in the next 100 days. He wrote those words on March 19, 1943. He died on April 18, exactly 30 days later. Even in death, Yamamoto's calculations were precise. He just couldn't change the outcome. So what did you think about Yamamoto's tragic foresight? Did this change how you see the architect of Pearl Harbor? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like. It helps more history enthusiasts discover these untold perspectives from the war. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the moments that shaped World War II. There are so many more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories about commanders who saw the future clearly but couldn't change it. Real people facing impossible choices. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in Texas? Germany? Japan? Our community stretches across the entire world. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Pacific. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Isoroku Yamamoto's story is remembered not just as the man who planned Pearl Harbor, but as the man who knew exactly what would happen next.